Thanks. Thanks you guys for coming down and hanging out with us. And it's good to see developers in the crowd too, as well as audio people. So just in brief, what I wanted to talk about, I've been in the audio industry for a long time, specifically doing game audio since 1996. And over the years, I've found myself pretty much re-educating and answering a lot of the same questions over and over and over and over. And I've been around long enough that there's a new generation of developers coming in who may or may not understand sort of the traditional best practices in terms of dealing with a team of, I would guess in our case, external audio developers. So one of the things I wanted to talk about this year is sort of throwing out some points based on the different disciplines, which are music, sound effects, and sound design, and voiceover, and hopefully answering some questions from you guys as to what our process is, show you a little bit about what we do and why we need certain things from you in order to do our job correctly. And a lot of that's comes in the form of both tangible and non-tangible assets. Because we do have a process, it tends to be really complicated, and a lot of times, if you're not too familiar with audio or the process or the communication, it can get confusing and sometimes bogs down the project. And as we all know, audio is always the last in line, and that means we generally don't have a lot of time to turn stuff around. So our hope is to sort of have you ask some questions. We'll point out a few things that we like to do that will hopefully make for a better audio experience for you guys and improve the overall quality of your game. So what I'm going to do with the PowerPoint is I'm just going to flip through a few slides and then have you guys all introduce yourself, and then we'll just sort of take each of the disciplines one by one and have everybody sort of comment on what their specific processes and pipelines are, and hopefully give you all an idea of if you're interested in working with the external audio team, how you can sort of better it, and we can discuss the audio best practices and so forth. So this is our panel, and I will let everybody introduce themselves. Do you want to start on the end, Aaron's? Yeah. We'll come back to me.
I'm Aaron Walz, Walz Music and Game Audio Alliance. My experience is in full sound design. I started doing games in 1997.
I'm Stan LEPARD, and I've been working on games since about 1995, and I mostly do music work, composer and orchestrator. I work with other composers and orchestrate their music.
Do you want to name some titles if you want? Or
well, yeah, I worked on the Halo series and Age of Empires and Castleville, Familyville. So.
All right, cool.
Hello, Kevin Tone, that is my real name. Co-founder with Sound Rangers and composer and sound designer and anything else needed to be done. It's been since '98 we've been doing Sound Rangers and games long before that. So.
My name's Nick. I'm the founder and CEO of Somatone Interactive, and we've been around since about 2003, primarily servicing the casual game space. I'm the executive of the studio, so I don't actually write or compose anymore. I sort of manage the process.
I'm Ken Boynton. For years made my living voicing games, and recently started a communications and writing and production company called Message Glue. But I think I'm here mostly because I've voiced a crap load of games over the years, since going back to those very first Microsoft Golf games on a little SE30. So, and through the Halo series, and I guess when we did Halo Reach, they told me that I'd voiced more characters in that series than any other actor on the planet. So if there was a way to monetize that, that would be cool.
Thank you. Were you going to speak in your usual character voice today, or not?
It was processed. So.
All right. Okay, and I'm Barry. Kevin and I started Sound Rangers in 1998. I've been doing game audio really since 1996, and then we formed the company in 1998. And I compose, I do sound design, and the necessary managerial stuff for Sound Rangers and so forth. So I like to really be in the trenches all the time, so I can understand, especially now, the new technologies, the memory requirements, the new sample libraries, the tools that we use, and so forth, so that I can actually have this conversation. And that's it. So thanks, you guys. And then, so we'll kind of move on here to the sort of tangible and non-tangible asset list that I was discussing earlier. And I think to begin, we should talk about what we like to have when we're starting a new project, because for me personally, when we start a new project, there's always a lot of questions about the things that I have listed in the PowerPoint, and that's primarily how are we going to communicate if we're not local to the developer? What are the milestones? You know, what type of game is it? What's the platform? The platform usually drives what the memory and load time requirements are, which drives how much content we can do, and then some of the tangible stuff. And I find that even the smallest detail can really sandbag a project in ways that you wouldn't really think. But having, you know, for instance, an audio asset list that describes the sounds, has a clear file name convention, you know, allows you to find where the sounds occur in the game. Other things like art style guides, you know, a playable build with cheats, hopefully. All that sort of stuff really allows us to enter into a relationship which makes our life a little bit easier. So what I was hoping to do is just sort of ask around and see what you guys like to have at the beginning of a project. So if you get a call out of the blue or you're working with a current project, what do you need to get started so that the developers can hear this and you guys can explain that, you know, why do I need a clearly delineated XLS with file names, and why when I don't have that, that's a problem. Why when we have some animations that need sound synchronized to them, we can't just make the sound out of the blue. We actually have to have either video capture or you know, the animations exported from the build so that we can actually time synchronize our sounds to the animations. And when we don't have that, then it can cause train wrecks and so forth. So would anybody like to volunteer to go first? And you can be brief. I can certainly go on and on about it, but I was hoping that you guys, you know, maybe we can talk to, you know, music, sound design, and voice, and just kind of ask around, like, what do you guys prefer to have when you're entering into a new project?
Certainly an asset list is really, really helpful unless the developer wants me to come up with, you know, sound and what they should do, but I prefer an asset list to start with, and then I can suggest different things. File names are really important if they care. I don't want to rename 100 file names.
Yeah, or hand them off to the developer who then has to rename the files because it's breaking code. Because they didn't give you the file names to begin with that they were using, which is a problem because then it costs time and it costs a lot of headache for everybody.
Yeah, definitely art, animations. If it's available, a build is awesome. And like you mentioned, the animations can be a problem when the developer says, oh, you have a build so you can time the animations. And I'm like, well, not really. I mean, I can screen capture that and create, but I'd really prefer the original Swift files or whatever format the video is in.
Yeah.
It's really helpful. And the story and the game, you know, the entire development doc is really helpful for coming up with a theme for me.
Okay.
For me, communication's a big one, and I feel like the person who's usually left out is the programmer or engineer, who's on the other side of the producer, and that's the guy that I actually most usually want to talk to. The producers, you know, that we generally set up creative, and that remains, you know, as loose or tight as it sets up. But getting things plugged in properly, getting the kind of assets that you need, it's almost better just to go to the source, which is generally the tech on the other side. So if there's a way to fold that person in, which usually that's held off at the beginning, opening that part of the communication chain is pretty key, I think, to things moving quickly and getting the back and forth that we like to have for the kind of communication that's best for the game.
I think they can probably most directly answer the technical requirements as well, you know, in terms of how the sounds are going to get integrated. If there's middleware that you're going to work with that can help, you know, the design process and so forth. So I think touching base with the devs is super important. So for you developers, depending on what your structure is, if, you know, you have producers that are sort of the overarching, you know, people behind the project and they're handing information out to the devs, sometimes it's best, as you say, to have the creative talks with the producers and then the technical talks with the development people, because then you know that what you're handing off is getting interpreted properly by them. So how about music?
Well, yeah, it's really helpful to see the art when you're trying to figure out what kind of music to do, what the musical world is going to be. The art can suggest the style, the genre, the feeling. And it's also helpful to see how things move, even if you're not syncing to them, just because that can suggest tempos and the feeling.
How about reference material? If somebody's heading in a specific direction.
Yeah. If you happen to know of music that you think is right for the game, it's very helpful to share that with the composer, and share what you like and don't like about it. And yeah.
Okay, cool. And how about voiceover? Always has lots of questions to be asked.
Well, it's
Yeah.
nice to have, even a scratch track of some of the pacing. If you've been living with building the game for a while and you know how you want it to feel, even if you don't have the ability to read it in the way that you want it read, getting an idea for the pacing is good, because otherwise we're just guessing. And most actors will give you multiple takes to choose from, but if the more information we have up front, the better. And just in the online games, the first time this happened to me was just recently when we were supposed to match video. That was a tiny, tiny person, and you couldn't really, there was no audio attached to it, and you couldn't really see the mouth move, but English words had to go where there were no English words before. That's a challenge. So even if the audio that you have is crappy and embarrassing, please include it. It's a lot easier to shine something up that exists than it is to guess and make it up on the spot. And also think about the time it takes to, especially if you're casting and you want to hear some auditions, there's just human time it takes to reach out and get people to record and send them, and time for review. A lot of times things come in and the voices are wanted at the very last second, and it's just sort of impossible to rally troops all over the place. We get asked to cast a lot too, because having been in this a couple of decades, you get to know who's good at it. So happy to do that, but having a little lead time is helpful when you need to track people down.
Would you say that having character headshots and bios of each character is helpful for you guys to get into
Yeah,
the spirit of
pictures,
things?
and even pop culture references are good. This guy should sound a little bit like, pick your movie star or TV character. It's helpful to get a reference that way.
Okay, cool. I also want to mention, if you guys have any questions, just feel free to throw them at us at any time. We're doing a Q&A at the end, but feel free to ask as we go too, because we have a lot to cover in a short amount of time.
Just make sure you raise your hand, and Amy will come along with the mic over there, and so you can say it in the mic so it'll get online.
Any questions so far? All right. So what I want to do is address each of the three disciplines that I've outlined: sound design, music, and voice. So we're going to move on to sound design, and I think we've covered a little bit of this to begin with, but I think, like, when we're talking sound effects, one of the most important things that that we could have probably is obviously an asset list that has a clear description of the sounds, the file names, the revision the cycles, places for feedback, and so forth. We can't really do much without that. It's often nice to have a build. I was going to ask you guys whether you prefer a playable build or not. I know sometimes that sort of thing is not available, but in the end, for us to get into the game and to see what the game mechanic is, see how all the UI interacts with the game sounds, with the character sounds, and all that sort of stuff is really important for us to get a feel for how the sounds are going to work. And it also sort of gives us a feel for how integration-wise the background sound is going to work against the UI, against the music, and all of that is really helpful if you have a playable build. We do have some pretty fancy equipment that we use. When I was talking earlier about having synchronized sound, a lot of the times we'll ask for animations just so we can time synchronize our stuff. Those animations get exported into a format we can then bring into our, what we call digital audio workstations, to work against. And through all of that, we generate sounds that we then pass back to you guys. So for the sound designers on the panel, are there specific things that you guys feel that you need more of from a developer, or any issues that you find that are confusing or would like you could streamline a little bit more?
I would say, well, the next two, the asset list and the animations, having those together. The playable build is nice because it's more of a reference. You can't really work off of a playable build when you're doing sound design. You really need a clear organization between the asset list and the animation, so you're just removes all the guesswork. When you sit down to work, you want to get in the flow. You want to go, okay, this character has these 20, movements, but a lot of times what we get is one animation per character. So it's like, well, here's the animation, here's one guy, and here's one animation. He's going to be doing these 20 things.
Yeah, it could be multiple animations that are coming together at runtime.
Yeah. So, and that's all you'll get. And then so you'll do all those 20 things, then you'll get it back from the developer saying, well, half of those are out of sync. Well, I'm surprised half of them were in sync because there was no...
Right.
Well, that's another thing with the build is that sometimes developers think that we have time to sit around and recreate every single possible thing that can happen in the game. And
Right.
one game we made, sometimes it takes 5, 10, 15, 20 minutes or longer for a certain animation to happen.
Right.
And they're like, oh, well, you have a build, so you don't need that animation. Right. I'm like, well, I'm not going to play the game for 20 minutes at a time and see it once. You know,
right.
I need to have that isolated.
It's only one time in a game if you do these certain things, and yeah.
Well, that's, I think, one of the problems that I see is that there's a lot of this sort of nebulous stuff that happens when we're trying to track down what the sound is and where it happens and how we can extract it out of the game to put it on our DAWs timeline to then synchronize the sound. There's a lot of time wasted, and I think that sometimes you can compensate for that, sometimes not, but that's a little bit of this weird gray area that you get into where, as a developer, you can greatly expedite our process by giving us these sorts of things so that we don't have to burn a lot of time looking for them in the build. So it streamlines our process. Generally, you're probably going to get better results because we can focus on making the sound right as opposed to focus on, what's going on with this. I had somebody ask me once, I was working on a game years ago, and they asked, I said, I need some spider sounds. And my response was, what does that mean? Okay, you want spider sounds, but is it, hairy and have horns, or is it meek and, cute? And, does it wear boots? I mean, all of that kind of affects what I need to do, from a sound design perspective. And when I don't have that, I'm going to give you some spider sounds, and I'll probably have to do it 50 times because it's not going to be right when you have something visualized in your mind. So the more information we can get from you guys, the more quickly we can do the sounds. It keeps the revision processes down, which is kind of a pain for both sides because if you're, because audio is coming at the end, there's often not a lot of time for the revisions. So if we can get it right the first time, that's great. But by getting it right, we need to have some of this stuff from you guys. And then middleware considerations, you guys, Nick, you probably try and figure out what the integration path is going to be when you're loading into a project, if it's, Fmod, WIs, Lua scripting, whatever. Because that kind of greatly determines what you're going to do creatively in terms of how many sounds, how the music's going to work, whether there's, looping sounds, one-shots, variation, pitch modulation, all that. How do you approach that?
The first thing is really to establish whether there is a technical audio person within the developer or whether that person doesn't exist at all, which is often not the case, and there's this gap where they kind of want you to fulfill that hole without really ever communicating that. So you will be handing off files to people who don't really have much experience with implementation. They'll do their best to plug it in, and there will be inevitable problems that they then kind of point back to you as being the source of the issue, when really there's just a hole in the pipe that they never solved for. So that kind of comes back to the communication, which is, I think, really key just in setting up the expectations of who's going to do what, when, so you can anticipate that and, kind of plan for assets being kind of temp on a first deliverable while those kinks are getting ironed out. Then once you kind of understand the methodology and you sort of can interpret what's going on behind the scenes, you can hopefully read the tea leaves a little bit and try and help them kind of figure it out. But particularly in casual games, it's a sorely missing person in this, to me, in this genre, because there's never usually enough to warrant a dedicated person for that, and so it's basically skipped entirely.
Yeah.
And it just opens a huge black box in terms of how things are actually going to turn out once you hand them off.
I think it's a really good opportunity to suggest things that could benefit the game as a whole in terms of how the audio is integrated. So sometimes I find the developers are familiar with stuff that's pretty common for us in terms of randomization, pitch modulation, just some simple things to do to make a gunshot sound different every time you hear it. And that's often a good time, a point to bring up with a developer. Do you have this capability? What are your capabilities? Is there a dev in place to do that? If you want us to, suggest things that can make the game a little bit cooler, it's nice to have a developer that will take all that and ingest it. Question. Sorry. Okay.
I was kind of wondering how early is too early to engage with you guys in this process. And if there's some kind of relationship when you do a partnership and say you're contracted to say, okay, we want you, say we're missing that technical audio person, like you suggested for a casual mobile game. Could there be some form of engagement that says we want to be prepared when it's go time because we know it's going to be the end, but could we engage on a light level to build up to that so we are prepared? Is that?
Yeah, it's never too early, really. I mean, because even get style-wise, we could be thinking about it creatively, technically, what's available. Even if the work doesn't start for months, it's
Right.
yeah.
And I've worked with some developers where what audio I created at the beginning changed what they did design-wise in the game.
Right.
Right, and I think too there's certain circumstances that might make you as a sound designer, preload what you need to do for the game. So if there's specific sound that's very unique that can't be sourced from a library or built very easily, let's say it's a racing game or something where you want to get some proprietary sounds, sometimes the pipeline that you have to take to source that material, the field recording, setting up sessions, getting people to bring their cars in to record them on a dyno or whatever, takes a little bit of setup time. So you don't want to do that at the last second because, again, we have a process that is pretty long from start to finish, and if you can give us time, that's great. And it also helps too. I mean, a lot of times if you are doing vertical slices of stuff, we can get some placeholder together for you so you can start getting, the feel of the audio for the game. So the earlier we have that information, the better. Yeah.
In general, we don't like last minute usually because
Yeah.
it's just hard to pull it. I mean, I just got an email yesterday from a client that said I need 433 voiceover lines with 6 characters by July 30th. And I thought, am I even home by then?
Right. You're editing while you're at the table with headphones on. Okay, so I wanted to touch on revision a little bit, revision processes, because we get asked about revisions sometimes, and I think what we just talked about will help avoid some of the revisions. So how do you guys deal with revisions when they come in? If it's a revision based on the scope of the game changes, that's one thing. If the sound is generally in the ballpark but is not quite right, how do you guys go about with your communication and making those revisions, and at what point do you feel that you need to charge more for that as opposed to making it part of the initial cost estimate and so forth? Anyone want to go ahead? Yes, Dan.
Well, my policy is always to just keep doing it over until the client's happy. But if something changes in the game and the spec changes, that's a different issue. Communication is the key, and just iterations.
And you feel, though, that if you have the proper materials up front so that you know that you're making sounds for a sci-fi game and not like, something else that's completely the opposite of the spectrum, at least you're starting off on the right foot.
You definitely try and gather as much information as you can before you even start. Sure.
And that's why, again, it's important, to have the asset list, animations. If there's particle effects, talk about where they occur, what they're going to do, and if there's a way for us to video capture or whatever. That's usually pretty important so that when we deliver stuff, we can deliver it to you once with maybe a little bit of revising. But if you have to start revising stuff 5 or 10 or 15 times, then something's probably broken in the process. Yeah.
And revisions are a totally normal thing. Like sometimes I think game developers feel bad, like, oh, I want, you didn't quite get what I wanted, and that's okay. I mean, when I did Ravenwood Fair for John Romero, he made me do it over 4 times. But each time he had specific moments that he said, oh, at 18 seconds, can you really bring it up and make it exciting? And at 35 seconds, I'm losing the melody, and it needs to do something, different, And so very specific feedback helps a lot. The nightmare we all have, I think, is when they say, oh, I don't like it.
Right. No reference, no reason.
Actors are going to think of it in terms of sessions. So if you have a session and you say, it's this number of lines and this time, then you do it and it goes off and you do 2 or 3 of each line. If you come back, if the words change, that's always a new session. If you're looking for something a little more subtle or an interpretation that got missed, that's going to pretty much be actor to actor. I always tended to figure out if the client's happy, I'll probably work again. So I tend to give those away fairly liberally, but some people will be sticklers for new session, new rate.
Okay.
I
That's
think
good.
what we'd love on our side is just some kind of honesty around what's still a work in progress and what's kind of final. We'll often get engaged with a game where they very well know that half of this is going to change, and so you may as well tell me that up front, and we cannot waste our time trying to design final assets for something that everybody, except for us, knows is sort of just a work in progress. We'll happily give you, I think everybody here would happily give you a temp asset to plug in as a placeholder, so we don't waste our time spending hours designing something that's just going to get tossed out. So there's no harm in telling us. It really saves everybody a huge headache if we just know up front what's done and what isn't, so we can really focus appropriately.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Hey, Amy, do you want to grab the mic for a question?
Can you touch upon doing voiceovers with character development and how revisions come into play and expense of it all, if they have to be redone? Can you touch upon voiceovers and character development and how the expense of redoing the voiceovers come into play, with whether or not there are continual expenses each time of a voiceover if you don't like a character sound?
They'll probably be taken care of in casting, maybe.
Well, in general, you would make that call when you describe the character and then you cast for it, and say, that's the person I want, or, I like what you did, but I'm looking for it to be a little more gravelly, or it needs to have a Slavic accent, or whatever the ingredient is, that you get to that before you actually record. And then the best way to avoid that is to be in on the session and listen in while the record's going down. So you make sure you get what you want. And every one of us who's ever done this work fully expects and loves it when a director is involved. We work on our own pretty well because we tend to be narcissistic and we love to sit across the room and look at how cool we are doing our jobs. But it's always nice when the person whose brain developed that is listening in and saying, yeah, no, that's not it, try it again. It's more fun, it's more satisfying for us, and then you get what you want the first time.
All right, cool. So we're going to move on to music here so we don't run out of time. So a few musically specific things. I guess when you're talking music for a game, you sort of enter into the same conversations as you do sound effects, style of game, genre, what's the platform, reference material, how much music, then usually an asset list that details sort of, the type of music and the file names and so forth. So I kind of wanted to talk to you guys a little bit more about, when you're engaging in a musical composition for a game, what types of things do you look for straight out of the gates?
One of the things I don't see on your list there is the target demographic. I think
Target, that's what I forgot, isn't it? Yes.
Yeah.
Tweener or over 40, right? Okay.
Those are the two demographics.
Right. Okay. Right. So there you go. So Stan, what are some of the things that in a best case scenario would you like to see so that you can fully do what you need to do and deliver stuff right the first time? Yeah,
the asset list, the functions of every piece of music, how it works in the game, what happens before and after it, if you know that, and your authoring platform. If you're using something like Wise, that's really good to know because there's a lot of possibilities. What else? Oh, the emotional feeling you're looking for with each piece of music. You should know that.
storyline and so forth.
Storyline, of course.
Yeah. And so if you're doing adaptive stuff, what do you need in terms of talking with a developer and integration and so forth? Are there specific requirements that you need to, specific things you need from the developer in order to take the adaptive path?
Well, yeah, it's a lot more complex and a lot more time consuming, and you're going to deliver a lot more assets if it's a highly adaptive score. So you need to factor that in. I'm sorry, what was that?
And determine how the gameplay is affecting your implementation of your music and how the music's broken down into an adaptive format.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's, in fact, that goes to your question earlier. It's if you expect to have an adaptive score, highly adaptive score, it's really a good idea to talk to somebody who knows music, or how music's put together, and how the middleware that you're using or the authoring environment that you're using, what the technical capabilities of that are, so that they can help you work out how to, spread out the music and cut it up and put it back together in different ways.
I think it's really important, too, to discuss the style of music that you're looking for and provide reference material because, as I mentioned here, not all music is created the same. And a lot of times we find during the compositional process, there's a lot of music that takes much longer to do, and you have to really pay attention to the harmonic and melodic considerations, whether you even want some sort of melodic content within the music. And so for me personally, the conversation I usually have is, what is the style of music? How is that going to affect the demographic for sure? Is there reference material? We always ask for reference material, and that usually comes from other games or film or TV. And then you take a listen to it, what's the instrumentation that's happening, which drives, what we need to do with our gear, which is generally sample library. Now with music, we can hire live players, 1 or 2 players on up to a live orchestra. And when you're talking budget, sometimes that's nice to talk about to see, you can do a lot of realistic stuff with sample library, but it's nice to also put live players on it. And I think at the beginning of the process, it's nice to talk about whether there's some budget to put some live players on it and if it's appropriate for the style of music. I think 8-bit game stuff's a little bit different than orchestral, but it's good to point out, what path you want to go down musically. Because I know you do you're tracking a lot of live stuff these days.
Yeah, well, obviously a full orchestra isn't really in the budget, but what developers don't know sometimes is that adding 1 or 2 live instruments can really make a big difference. So you can bring in a violinist and she'll play every violin part for you, and you can track her 8 times and make a whole string section. So that kind of thing can make a really big difference to add humanity to it.
Yeah.
The other thing I would add to this too is how much time they're going to spend in this area. So I like to know, is this going to be like a 5-minute, thing that they're doing, or is this 30 seconds? Or because sometimes people have asked me for a minute loop in something that's so quick that nobody's ever going to stay in that for a minute. So it's really a waste of money and resources.
Right.
Put that money in somewhere where they're going to be watching the same screen for 10 minutes, have a longer loop. So that's important as well.
Cool. Okay. So the other consideration, too, is the platform that you're developing for and how much music you can realistically put in, because we have a lot of occasions when somebody will say, well, we need, this amount of music. I'm like, well, you're not going to have that amount of music in your game because there's sound effects and art and other things that all arm wrestle for that memory. And so it's good to take a look at that because it's pretty difficult for us to take, to go write a lot of music and then have it all chopped down to a much shorter amount, because that's going to affect budget and the amount of time it takes us to turn stuff around, which is another thing too, the time considerations. It's best to get us involved early because musically that if you're doing really dense orchestral stuff, that's going to take longer to compose than certainly doing some sound design and other forms of music. So if you can get that stuff to us up front, then we can then sort of calculate how much time it's going to take us to get those assets to you. I think from a revision standpoint, some of it works the same way. I think with music, a lot of times if you have a little bit of a knowledge of music and can determine what about the music you don't like, then that helps with the revision process. So if you're writing something and there's a trumpet line and you don't like something about it, if you can identify that it's a trumpet line, then maybe it's as easy as just removing the trumpet line and keeping everything else in there, as opposed to you just hate all of the music and we want to go in a different direction. So how do you guys feel about revisions and so forth in terms of communicating with a developer about that?
Communicating what?
So if somebody says, not quite sure what's happening, it's not quite right, I'm not sure what I'm hearing, but I know it's not quite right, how do you generally go back and make those revisions? Do you have a musical conversation with them, or do you,
the more specific,
try and pinpoint
the
what it
better.
is?
If you can identify the exact time that you're hearing something you don't like, and if you can
Okay.
maybe identify what it is, or the range or something, the frequency range.
Instrumentation too, probably.
Yeah.
If there's something like they don't want horns in there and
So
would
they
prefer
don't always
something
know
else.
what instrument it is, you know.
Yeah.
It's like that thing at 18
Yeah.
seconds. I don't like that. I'm like,
Right.
Yeah.
that's a bassoon. You
Right.
know?
Yeah.
But we
Right.
try to
That's what that
avoid
is.
musical lingo because we don't want to alienate
Right.
the game developer, obviously.
Right. Just make your best guess if you don't know what
Yeah.
it is.
We won't judge.
Call it whatever. We'll figure it out.
Okay.
But I was going to say on the thing earlier, it's helpful to know that some instruments just cannot be duplicated very well with virtual instruments. Violin's a good example. Saxophone is another one. So if you're working with a composer, you can talk to them about that and see what your expectations are in terms of realism in the music.
Yeah, cool. Okay, well, sorry about that.
No worries. So from the game developer's point of view, how long would you expect the score to be, like how long does it take to write a score, and how much time do you put in to write maybe about a minute of music?
A minute of music is usually about a day of work for me. And that doesn't mean that it's going to be done and finished forever, but it means that it's my first draft and the best effort. So oftentimes I'll really want to go back later and add stuff, or there might be a revision process. But I think a minute of music a day is pretty realistic. I don't know about what you guys think.
I'm about the same. I've heard of people like film score guys that are really fast, but I'm about the same as you.
And that's for relatively orchestral stuff, for the most part, as opposed to beat-driven
Yeah,
music.
it kind of depends on how dense the music is, how
Yeah.
many musical events are happening in a given stretch of time. If it's a lot of stuff and a lot of instruments, a lot of different notes,
Yeah.
that's going to take longer.
And then programming it all, obviously, to make it sound like the real thing. Okay. Cool.
And that goes back to having, good reference material and knowing what you're doing, and just, okay, I can go 100 and do this without any questions or confusion.
And making sure you leave time in your schedule to have feedback and revisions, rather than having the delivery date be 2 days before the launch of the game.
Yeah. Music takes a while. I mean, it's complicated. We have carry a lot of gear, a lot of sample libraries. We charge what we do because it's expensive to own that gear and run it and maintain it, and then have to spend years of training and doing a lot of stuff to get to the level of being able to write it in the first place, and so it takes time. It takes a lot of knowledge. You have to know how music works to try and get to the finish line. What's in your head. We have to figure out what's in your head using the material that you give us to arrive in a place where you're happy with it. So you have to give it a little time. Is there any questions thus far? We doing okay in time? I feel like we need to move to voice now, and then we will do a little Q&A wrap up, and that's it. So I'm a little bit confused sometimes about the voiceover process. I've done a lot of it over the years, not voicing stuff, but being involved with casting and recording and editing and all that sort of stuff. So Ken's going to be doing his own presentation at 3, so we don't want to give away too much. But I think there's some really interesting things about voice. I'll try and just touch briefly on these things. I think the first thing of importance is the whole professional versus non-professional thing. And I think as professional audio designers, we always want to use professional talent, and it really does make a big difference. You'll get what you want more quickly and efficiently, and a lot of the pro guys can really get into characters the way you need them to. But with that said, we need a lot of things for you to do what you need to do. The asset list scripts that describe what the character's doing, the storyline, preferably file naming conventions so the editors know exactly which line should be named which, and all that sort of stuff. So do you, when you're starting a new project, are there things that you don't like to see? Like in terms, like if somebody gives you a script, maybe the font's too small or there's not enough of a description, or when they say we want a fairy voice, they're really talking about a prophet. You know, what are some of the things that you think could help
Well, it comes back down
elevate the
to
communication?
everything you're talking about, it's clarity and communication. Personally, I hate Excel.
Wow, I
My
didn't know
training is, you know, theatrical, so it's scripts and narrative and story structure, and an Excel sheet blows it up. Having said that, I've voiced about 20 years of games using Excel sheets, so I've gotten over it. When we started, you know, you'd think, God, I want to react to what another actor's doing, but each one of these is its own little file. So you just get to the point where you have to imagine that and make it real and figure out what it would sound like in its most basic ingredients. So a lot of the stuff I used to hate, I don't. It's just challenging and fun to figure out a way to make it work. But it's really clarity and knowing what you want. And I think being real clear and basic about, I really want this guy to sound like George Clooney with a bad cold. I mean, whatever it is that you can connect it to in pop culture is gonna make the process happen faster. A lot of actors want to have their agents in between, and so they just want to go do the session and do it their way because that's what they do, because they're actors. And you know, I personally don't like to work that way. I want it to be a collaborative process. So, and you can certainly ask an agent, you know, I really like the way Jeff did that. I'd like to talk to him on the phone for 15 minutes and chat with him about exactly the feel that I'm looking for. Anybody who's halfway good at what they do will agree to that. And if the agent says no, then tell him, fine, I'll never use any of your people again. And once you threaten, he'll say, well, I guess you could talk to him for 10 minutes. But make it work like you're looking at anything else. You want to get what you want, and the way that you work and get what you want, it's our job to figure out what that is, not to give it to you the way we like to give it to you. We're malleable and bendable and abusable, so abuse us.
Cool. Cool.
Actually,
Go ahead.
For me personally, of all the three kind of components of audio, I think voiceover is the one you most don't want to skimp on, because it's the first thing that'll just ruin your game. There's nothing like bad VO to just kill a soundtrack or an audio experience.
Cost me $200 to have him say that. Just
Yeah.
yeah.
Can I get it now?
I wanted to pay you off camera.
But there's a lot of people who try to avoid it because it's not cheap. Talents, you know, you have to pay for good actors, but man, it's worth it. It's a really good investment if you're going to go ahead and actually have a voice in your game or more. Don't have your friend do it. Don't have your secretary do it, or your
Programmer.
Do it yourself. Programmer. It just is bad. It will be bad. There's just no way around it not turning out right.
And if you come at 3, I'll help you find those people. I have some good secrets.
Yeah, exactly.
Or watch it online.
Well, yeah, the other thing too I was going to point out is a lot of times, like, you guys can, you know, if you have, let's say, 10 different characters and you have a limited budget, there are ways for a talent to do multiple voices realistically, especially if they're occurring in different parts of the game and not together. So you can sometimes work with the budget by having the actor double up and triple up on voices and so forth. Which is a good way of getting what you need on a limited budget and not a limited budget, actually.
If you don't have people that you know or that you've worked with who are that versatile, make sure when you audition that you say, I liked so-and-so for this part, have them read for this and this as well. It's easy for you to see what the differences are in the characters, and if you give good descriptions, then, you know, we can use our instruments are in pieces, so we can add placement, nasal, soft palate, hard palate. I once watched a guy talk through how the Beatles have the exact same accent, but by placing it differently, they all sound, even at the same pitch, they sound different. John's voice was in here, so Ringo's voice sounded more like it a cold. George's sounded a bit back further from the nose, and Paul's was a soft palate. So they all put in, it's exact same. Yeah, that goes out to Pat Fraley, because he's the one who showed me that, and he's a genius. But it's really incredible that just placement, just a little bit different placement can give you the separation that you need. And then these guys would say, well, when that happens, the main character in that scene, let's just leave him alone, but maybe we can pitch the second guy down just a little bit. That adds a little more gravity to his voice, and then you'll get even more separation between characters.
Do the actors charge extra for doing extra characters?
The unions have rates for you get up to, again, this is at 3. No, I'll say it today. You get up to, actually now there's up to 10 voices in a 6-hour session, and there's a rate for that. And non-union, it's usually, you're just going to negotiate a rate that's fair, so.
Cool. Okay, so we have 5 minutes. Do you guys have questions? Any burning questions you want answered?
Actually,
About
really
anything?
quick too, I
Okay.
wanted to ask a question to the panel about voiceover
Okay.
stuff, and especially you too. What do you do when you get a script that has typos on it and you're not sure what they mean? But even further than that, what if the character, they say things in strange idioms, like maybe you get a Russian script, or, how do you handle that? Because you don't want to insult the client, or, because sometimes I've brought it up and they say, oh no, it's not a mistake. Like, do you just record it as is, or do you insist on fixing it?
I usually say things like, I'm sorry I saw that differently than it was written, and I'll include that one. Just in case, if I'm right and that's how they meant it to be,
Right.
then they have it.
Yeah, give them their way and then the right way.
Yeah, exactly. And the same guy who taught me the Beatles thing, Pat Fraley's a LA talent who's been down there 40 years and voiced just about everything. But he's the same way about that. He said, I'm not a writer, but, and I wouldn't presume to be a writer, but if it seems to me the character might say it this way if they were in that situation. I'd rather just make the mistake and then send on the thing and say, I accidentally read one weird, but it sounded kind of cool. I don't know. Just throw it away if you want to, And often those end up in the game.
We actually require our scripts 48 hours prior to a session so we can read it and ask these questions. And if we don't have them answered, we'll push the session because there's no way to avoid respecting the talent's time and the associated fees with bringing them back. Even if they're pretty friendly, you have to compensate them, and those are expenses you pass on. So it's better to get the script in advance so you can write back and say, how do you pronounce this, or what is this name, or is this a typo, or it might be a total mess, in which case the whole thing goes on hold, and 2 weeks later you're actually doing the session.
Especially names.
Names, locations, they may not even mention a specific accent, which it turns out that they want because you keep seeing all these references to somewhere in France. And all of a sudden you realize this whole thing's happening in France. And so does everybody need an accent, or what's the perspective of the listener? If you don't read it first,
Cool.
it's a black box.
I wanted to ask you guys if you've ever had an experience where you got an asset list when at an appropriate time in the production cycle, and you filled it out and everybody liked everything, and then you played the game after it was completed, and you said, oh, there should have been something here. Do you have some advice for developers about how to avoid that pitfall?
Send us a build. Especially after we put in the audio, send us another build so we can figure that out before you launch, and that requires time. So I think it's making sure you provide that time after delivery before you're delivering it to the market.
That happens all the time.
Yeah. It's usually not a problem because we want it to be as good as it can be too. So.
I always find too, it's a bit of a collaboration too. Even if you have a build and an asset list, we'll scrub through the game and find stuff that should have sound that doesn't, and then suggest that to the developer. And it's always like, oh, great, we didn't see that, didn't catch it, let's put it in, we'll make the sound. And then it's nice for them because we're using our eyes and ears, you know, to really examine what's going on and what's making sound. So oftentimes we'll dig up stuff that they didn't see and then make suggestions for how to, you know, get it in the game. Cool.
If we have time, I'm curious about the union versus non-union issues. Can we talk about that at all?
For a minute.
For voice?
Yeah.
You don't want to give away too much of your 3 o'clock, right?
Yeah. It's good stuff. I worked on it quite a bit. So.
Come back at 3 and you'll see.
You guys can come back at 3 too if you want.
Yeah. Okay, any question? Okay, go ahead.
With budgets kind of getting smaller in casual games, but also with casual games evolving quite a bit, going mobile and all that kind of stuff, do you guys see any trends in how you think audio across the 3 different disciplines will change and what impact that might have on the process? Like, you know, next 2-3 years, that kind of thing?
Well, try and streamline our process to, you know, to make it work with shrinking budgets and so forth. And I think a lot of times, you know, musically, you're probably going to be less inclined to use live players if the budgets shrink. You know, there's technology out there that, you know, pre-manufactures stuff and makes it faster and quicker for us to do it, although it's, you know, generally not a great way to go about composing music or doing sound design. But, you know, some of the audio technology is kind of coming up to the point of where you can do a lot with minimal effort, and the results aren't always great, but sometimes you have to make those sacrifices, I think, a little bit. What do you guys think?
I'm also seeing a rise in production values in casual games too. I've worked on 3 games with full orchestral scores, and I'm doing a couple more this year.
Yeah, cool.
So people are starting to pay for that. I think they just want to stand out from the crowd.
So it is going in both directions.
Yeah.
That's great. Okay, anyone else? That's it, I guess. All right on time, too. Thanks, you guys. Thanks for coming down.